Okay, so today we're going to take a deep dive into a really interesting story developing right now in international relations.
Hmm.
We're going to look at the expulsion of South Africa's ambassador to the U.S., Ebrahim Rasool.
Okay.
We've got a pretty detailed CBS News report that we're going to be looking at as our main source. And what we want to do is really go beyond just the headlines. We're
All
going to
right.
try to unpack the sequence of events and the underlying reasons and what this could mean, for the future of the relationship between the U.S. and South Africa. It just feels like there's a lot more to this than meets the eye.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that jumps out right away, at least from this CBS News report, is the sheer speed and the directness of the U.S. response. So Ambassador Rasool was given just 72 hours to leave the country. The expulsion order landed on Friday, March 14th, 2025.
Wow.
And that's important because this is just 2 months after he had even arrived in Washington.
Right.
So that kind of swift action really signals a pretty profound level of disapproval in diplomatic circles.
Yeah, for sure. And the official communication for the State Department, according to the report, was equally unambiguous. They issued a diplomatic notice on Monday, March 17th, withdrawing recognition, ceasing all privileges and immunities,
Wow.
and declaring him persona non grata. Persona non grata, that term is basically diplomatic shorthand for an unwelcome person.
Right.
It's basically the strongest possible way that a host country can say to a foreign diplomat, you need to leave, you know?
Yeah, it's that serious. Yeah. And then, just to add another layer to this whole thing, Secretary of State Marco Rubio's social media post, as quoted in the report, is pretty blunt as well. He called Rasool a race-baiting politician who hates America and President Trump.
Wow.
That's strong language coming from somebody so high-ranking. I mean, it really underscores the intensity of the sentiment behind this decision.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so let's dig into the why here. What specifically triggered such a forceful reaction? So the CBS News report points to remarks that Ambassador Rasool made during a webinar. It was hosted by the South African Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection.
Okay.
What did he say that led to this whole diplomatic fallout?
Yeah, so the report details that Rasool characterized President Trump's policies and practices as a white supremacist response to growing demographic diversity in the United States.
Oh, wow.
So, I mean, that's a pretty big accusation, right? And it's clearly touching upon really, really sensitive and highly debated issues within the U.S.
Yeah, no doubt about it. So how did South Africa then respond to the news that their ambassador was, effectively asked to leave the United States?
Yeah, the initial reaction from South Africa, according to CBS, seemed to be a mix of concern and a need to kind of gather more information. So President Cyril Ramaphosa, he addressed journalists on Monday. He acknowledged that the U.S. was obviously not happy. He emphasized how crucial the relationship is. He pointed out that the U.S. is South Africa's second largest trading partner after China.
Right.
So that really highlights the significant economic ties that are at stake here. He also mentioned that he's expecting a full report from Ambassador Rasool once he returns to Pretoria.
Okay, and it sounds like the South African foreign minister also weighed in on this publicly.
Yeah. The foreign minister spoke on South African television and described the expulsion of Ambassador Rasool as unprecedented and regrettable, especially considering Rasool's long history, as an activist against apartheid.
Right.
But what was really interesting here was the foreign minister's call for a different approach to diplomacy.
Yeah.
They were advocating for engagement behind closed doors rather than what they called megaphone and Twitter diplomacy.
Oh, wow.
That seems like a direct comment on the very public way the U.S. handled this whole thing. So
Yeah.
it does kind of make you think about how effective are these kinds of public pronouncements when you're dealing with, sensitive diplomatic matters.
That's a really interesting point about the contrasting styles of diplomacy there. This TBS News report also brings up the fact that Rasool's appointment as ambassador was actually controversial right from the start, even before these recent remarks. Why was there, opposition to him within South Africa itself?
Yeah, so this really takes us into the internal political landscape of South Africa.
Yeah.
So after the last elections, the ruling African National Congress, ANC, didn't actually win a big enough majority to govern on their own, so they had to form what's called a Government of National Unity, or GNU.
Okay.
Now, GNU essentially means that different political parties are having to come together to govern.
Right.
And that obviously creates all these opportunities for different viewpoints and potential friction. And Rasool's appointment became this huge point of contention right away within this new coalition.
So it wasn't just the U.S. that had like reservations about him, potentially representing South Africa?
Exactly. Professor William Gumet of Witwatersrand University is actually quoted in the report saying that Rasool's appointment was opposed by all the other political parties
Oh, wow.
that were part of this new government of national unity. He described it as the first large point of contention within the coalition. And according to Professor Gumet, the non-ANC partners eventually just caved in, allowing the appointment to proceed.
Wow. So what were the main reasons behind the opposition from within South Africa then? What specifically made these other political parties uneasy about Rasool taking on such a crucial role, in the U.S.?
Yeah, so the report highlights a few key areas of concern. Primarily, there was this perception that Rasool held views that were sympathetic to Iran and Hamas,
Yeah.
coupled with very strong anti-Israel sentiments.
Okay.
So Professor Gumet specifically mentions Rasool's past comments that were seen as favorable towards Hamas. And just as a reminder, Hamas is designated as a terrorist organization by both the U.S. and Israel. There were even reports that he had boasted about having ties with Hamas leadership. Additionally, his strong support for South Africa's case at the UN's top court, accusing Israel of genocide in Gaza.
Wow.
That was another significant point of contention, especially given Israel's firm rejection of those accusations and, their assertion that their actions are in self-defense following Hamas's attack back in October of 2023. So you basically had a situation where the ambassador's known views on some pretty sensitive international issues,
Yeah.
Didn't exactly align with all the pardons in South Africa's new coalition government.
Right. So we've got this figure with a controversial background, even within his own country's new government, being appointed to a really important diplomatic position. And then he makes these very strong statements about the U.S. administration.
Right.
It really does seem like a situation ripe for diplomatic trouble. What does Professor Gumet think the potential consequences of all of this could be? And are there any paths to de-escalation?
Right. So Professor Gumet suggests that, if this relationship continues on this negative trajectory, the U.S. might just take further action,
Okay.
possibly in the form of, targeted economic sanctions against South Africa.
Mhm.
He even gets kind of specific about the potential impact. He warns of the risk of losing a significant number of jobs. He actually gives figures between 300,000 and 400,000 direct jobs in South Africa,
Wow.
with hundreds of thousands more kind of indirect job losses.
Right.
Given the economic ties that we already talked about, that would obviously be a pretty huge blow to South Africa's economy.
Absolutely.
This really underscores, how interconnected our global economies are and how these political decisions can have very real-world consequences for ordinary people.
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds incredibly serious.
Mm.
But the report does also note that Professor Gumet is, at least optimistic, saying that it's not too late.
Mm.
What are the solutions he proposes to try and, kind of mend this relationship?
Yeah. So Professor Gumet puts forward a couple of pretty interesting ideas. Firstly, he suggests that President Ramaphosa could come out and make a public statement,
Yep.
Labeling Ambassador Rasool's comments as unacceptable.
Okay.
And, really clearly reaffirming the importance of the relationship with the U.S. and acknowledging the aid that South Africa receives. Secondly, he points out that there are reportedly a lot of South Africans who have connections within President Trump's inner circle.
Okay.
And he suggests actively engaging with them. And then lastly, and maybe most interestingly, he proposes actually sending a delegation of representatives from the non-ANC partners within the Government of National Unity to the U.S. to directly engage with the Trump administration.
Okay.
So the idea here, it seems, is to kind of present this broader perspective from South Africa's leadership and emphasize that, the relationship with the U.S. is just too important to risk.
Right. So to recap for you listening, we've seen a swift and quite forceful expulsion of South Africa's ambassador based on some pretty strong accusations that he made. We've also learned that his appointment was already kind of a point of contention within South Africa's newly formed coalition government due to his past stances on certain international issues. And now looking ahead, there are potentially huge consequences, for the relationship between the U.S. and South Africa, particularly in the economic sphere. It's a really interesting, multifaceted situation where, the internal political dynamics of South Africa seemed to have directly intersected with its international relations.
Yeah.
It led to this pretty dramatic outcome.
It did. And what's really noteworthy here is the speed and the very public nature of the U.S. response, which maybe reflects, the current climate of international relations. Like public pronouncements and social media seem to play an increasingly important role in diplomatic affairs.
Yeah, that's true.
So it really makes you think, what are the long-term implications of this kind of shift toward a more public form of diplomacy?
Yeah, it's so interesting. So for you listening, consider the complexities at play here.
Right.
In a world where, countries hold diverse political viewpoints and where public discourse is so pervasive, how do nations effectively navigate these really delicate diplomatic relationships? What is like the appropriate balance between a country's right to express its opinions and the expectations of the international community, especially when, those opinions are perceived as critical or even antagonistic?
Mhm.
And ultimately, what role does public discourse through, both traditional media and social media platforms play in shaping these really high-stakes relationships between nations? It's definitely a lot to think about long after our deep dive today. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.